Welcome to The Chinese Spy Balloon, where we'll delve into some of the most perplexing and intriguing incidents in recent history. On this journey, we will explore the events surrounding the Chinese balloon incident, a mysterious occurrence that captured the world's attention in 2023. But that's not all. We also examine other enigmatic incidents that have left experts scratching their heads, from unsolved disappearances to unexplained phenomena. Join us on a voyage of discovery as we seek to uncover the truth behind these mysteries and shed new light on some of the most baffling cases of our time. The 2020s have been a bizarre decade thus far. We had global pandemics, murder hornets, and strange balloons, sometimes referred to only as UFOs, flying over international airspace across the globe in 2023. This weird occurrence isn't the first time strange balloons were sent flying through the air. Fugo was an incendiary balloon weapon deployed by Japan against the United States during World War II. A hydrogen balloon measuring 33 feet in diameter carried a payload of 4 11-pound incendiary devices plus one 33-pound anti-personnel bomb, or alternatively one 26-pound incendiary bomb, and was intended to start large forest fires in the Pacific Northwest. Between November 1944 and April 1945, the Imperial Japanese Army launched about 9,300 balloons from sites on Honshu, of which about 300 were found or observed in the US and Canada, with some in Mexico. The balloons were carried by high altitude and high-speed currents over the Pacific Ocean, today known as the jet stream, and used a sophisticated ballast system to control altitude. The bombs were ineffective as fire starters due to damp conditions, causing only minor damage and 6 deaths in a single civilian incident in Oregon in May 1945. The Fugo balloon was the first weapon system with intercontinental range, with its attacks being the longest ranged in warfare. The balloon bomb concept was a brainchild of the Imperial Japanese Army's No. 9 Research Laboratory, founded in 1927. In 1933, Lieutenant General Rikichi Tada began an experimental balloon bomb program at Noborito, designated Fugo, which proposed a hydrogen balloon 13 feet in diameter, equipped with a time fuse capable of delivering bombs up to 70 miles. The project was stopped by 1935 and never completed. After the Doolittle raid in April 1942, in which American planes bombed the Japanese mainland, the Imperial General Headquarters directed Noborito to develop a retaliatory bombing capability against the US. In the summer of 1942, Noborito investigated several proposals, including long-range bombers that could make one-way sorties from Japan to cities on the US West Coast, and small bomb-laden seaplanes that could be launched from submarines. On September 9, 1942, the latter was tested in the Lookout Air Raid, in which a Yokosuka E-1 4Y seaplane was launched from a submarine off the Oregon coast. Warrant Officer Nobuo Fujita dropped 2 large incendiary bombs in Siskiyou National Forest, hoping to start a forest fire and safely return to the submarine. However, response crew spotted the plane and contained the small blazes. The Navy cancelled the program. Also in September 1942, Major General Suiki Kusaba, who had served in the original balloon bomb program under Tada in the 1930s, was assigned to the laboratory and revived the Fugo project with a focus on longer flights. The Oregon Air Raid, while not achieving its strategic objective, had demonstrated the potential of using unmanned balloons at a low cost to ignite large-scale forest fires. According to US interviews with Japanese officials after the war, the campaign was undertaken almost exclusively for home propaganda purposes, with the Army having little expectations for its effectiveness. Decades later, from January 28 to February 4, 2023, A Chinese-operated high-altitude balloon was seen in North American airspace, including Alaska, Western Canada, and the contiguous United States. On February 4th, the U.S. Air Force shot down the balloon over U.S. territorial waters off the coast of South Carolina, on the order of U.S. President Joe Biden. Debris from the wreckage was recovered and sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, for analysis. The American and Canadian militaries believed the balloon was for surveillance, while the Chinese government said it was a civilian meteorological research airship that had blown off course. Analysts said the balloon's flight path and structural characteristics were dissimilar from those typically used for meteorological research. Before the incident, Chinese officials and scientists highlighted balloons' usefulness in meeting China's domestic and military needs. The U.S. government declassified information from American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft deployed to track the balloon, which says it had signals intelligence equipment. The U.S. said that the balloon could geolocate electronic communications devices, including mobile phones and radios, and that it carried antennas and other equipment, clearly for intelligence surveillance, and was inconsistent with weather balloon equipment. The U.S. Department of State said that the balloon was part of a global Chinese military-directed surveillance effort in which Chinese spy balloons have flown over more than 40 nations on 5 continents. The incident increased U.S.-China tensions and prompted U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken to delay a diplomatic visit to Beijing, which was set to be his first since 2018. It also further strained Canada-China relations, as Canada summoned the Chinese ambassador over the violation of Canadian airspace. On February 3rd, the U.S. Department of Defense announced that a second Chinese balloon was passing over Latin America, and China confirmed ownership of this balloon. The use of balloons as military technology dates to the late 18th century and peaked during World War I. The United States and the Soviet Union continued to use them for surveillance during the Cold War. Despite mainly being made obsolete by surveillance satellites and drones, balloons have retained some advantages, such as a lower cost of production and deployment. In 2019, the U.S. Department of Defense increased investment in the military use of balloons under its Cold Star, an acronym for Covert Long-Dwell Stratospheric Architecture Program. The Pentagon reportedly incorporated high-altitude balloons into the military kill chain, focusing on hypersonic weapons, complementing Space Development Agency commercial satellite mega-constellations. Balloons could be preferred as a platform for their low-cost, lower altitude, and less predictable trajectories compared with satellites. The 2023 balloon incident occurred while U.S.-China relations were at their lowest point in decades amid increasing strategic competition between the two superpowers, including in espionage and critical economic and military sectors, including spaceflight, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, life sciences, 5G telecommunications, and quantum computing. The balloon incident followed previous Chinese government actions targeting the U.S., including the Chinese theft of the designs for the F-35 about 15 years earlier and successful Chinese government-sponsored cyberattacks targeting the Office of Personnel Management Security clearance files, the healthcare company Anthem, and the Marriott International System. In 2022, the U.S. and its allies imposed stringent additional export controls on the sale of foundational technologies, including advanced semiconductor chips and related technology, to China to inhibit any Chinese military buildup. The Biden administration has also sought to maintain critical sector supply chains independent from China. Based on information taken from a People's Liberation Army procurement portal, the balloon is believed to be manufactured by a civilian Chinese military contractor. An analysis by Reuters of an article in a Chinese state-run defense technology journal published in April 2022 showed increased interest in military balloon technology, suggesting China should induce and mobilize the enemy's air defense system, providing the conditions for the implementation of electronic reconnaissance and assessment of air defense systems' early warning detection and operational response capabilities. Following the downing of the balloon, official Chinese media published an article by a Beihang University professor and retired senior People's Liberation Army Air Force colonel, claiming the incursion fulfilled a strategy proposal in his 2014 paper titled Innovating Air Defense Systems, Long Stays in the Air and Instant Strikes, in which he claimed airships are the best choice for China to build its domestic air defense system. On February 9, 2023, the U.S. Department of State declassified balloon intelligence, saying that the balloon shot down over the Atlantic Ocean was part of a fleet of Chinese military surveillance balloons that had flown over more than 40 countries and across 5 continents, including Latin America and Europe. This was the 5th detected Chinese balloon over the continental United States since 2017. Chinese balloons suspected of surveillance activity have also entered the U.S. airspace over Florida, Guam, and Hawaii. In those instances, China was able to recover the balloons. No prior incursion persisted as long as the 2023 incident. Of the prior incidents, 1 occurred earlier during Biden's presidency, and 3 occurred during Donald Trump's presidency. The U.S. failed to detect some previous incursions at the time of their occurrence. Other pre-2023 incursions had been detected but had remained unexplained, classified by U.S. authorities as unidentified anomalous phenomena. Many previously unidentified incidents had been handed to the Defense Department task force responsible for investigating such events. In the 2 years preceding the 2023 incident, U.S. officials identified some incursions as Chinese spy balloons. The commander of the United States Northern Command, also known as U.S. Northcom, General Glenn Van Herk, said that the U.S. failure to detect and identify previous incursions was a domain awareness gap that we have to figure out. Van Herk has promoted the increased use of sensors and over-the-horizon radar to detect threats. In June 2020, a similar balloon was sighted in Sendai, Japan, which at the time was not identified as being of Chinese origin. Likewise, in September 2021, another balloon with similar features was sighted in Hashino, Japan, although this was also not identified as of Chinese origin. In February 2022, several balloons were spotted off the coast of Taiwan, which Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense said likely were for meteorological observations for the PLA's Eastern Theater Command, and posed no immediate security threat. The balloon carried an underslung payload described as a technology bay estimated to be the size of 2 or 3 school buses, and was powered by 16 solar arrays mounted on the payload. The balloon's diameter was sizably larger at 200 feet. U.S. Northcom and NORAD Commander General Glenn Van Herk estimated the payload weighed over 2,000 pounds. National Security Council spokesman Admiral John Kirby said the craft had a propeller and could be maneuvered. U.S. officials told foreign diplomats in Beijing that the craft had rudders and propellers. A Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson said it had limited self-steering capability. The U.S. Department of Defense said the balloon did not present a military or physical threat to people on the ground, and that shooting it down over water would be safer and increase the opportunity to study the wreckage for intelligence purposes. Antennas likely were used for collecting and transmitting signals intelligence. A publicly released U.S. State Department document, after the balloon was downed and debris collected, said that the balloon's solar arrays produced sufficient power to run multiple active intelligence collection sensors, and that the antennas on the balloon could collect and geolocate communications, including radio and mobile phone signals. Still, it was unclear what specific devices were targets. U.S. authorities identified the manufacturer of the balloon with high confidence as a company with direct ties to the People's Liberation Army. U.S. officials cited this as an example of military-civil fusion, in which Chinese civilian enterprises are highly integrated into China's military structure. Experts noted differences between the Chinese balloon and conventional weather balloons. Standard weather balloons have typically been around 20 feet wide, less than a quarter of the Chinese balloon's diameter. Although weather sensors have become more sophisticated over time, they have remained relatively unchanged since the 1970s and 1980s and have been consistent globally. Experts interviewed by the BBC said it was unusual for weather balloons to last as long as the one involved in the incident, and that the balloon might have been more sophisticated than China claims. Former U.S. Air Force General and NORAD official Charles Tuna Moore said that the Chinese surveillance technology on the balloon was inconsistent with meteorological missions. He said that the Chinese would likely be interested in collecting emissions or signals from various radar, weapons, and communication systems to try to detect vulnerabilities in the defenses of the US and its allies. High-altitude or stratospheric balloons are tough to detect. The 2005 study by the US Air Force, also known as the USAF's Air University, states surveillance balloons often present microscopic radar cross-sections, on the order of hundredths of a square meter, about the same as a small bird, and essentially no infrared signature, which complicates the use of anti-aircraft weapons. A 2009 research paper by a USAF officer found that such aircraft are inherently stealthy because of a tiny infrared signature at high altitude and because of the difficulty of radar detection, as balloons lack sharp edges and metal structures. The balloon's first reported sighting was on February 1, 2023, when civilians in a commercial airliner spotted it. On the same day, former Billings Gazette editor Chase Stokes spotted the object above Billings, Montana, after seeing reports that the airspace around Billings was closed. Initially, he assumed it was a star or a UFO. Doak contacted his friend and Billings Gazette photographer Larry Mayer, and the two photographed the balloon using telephoto lenses. Mayer also sent the images to various government agencies. After the photographs were published in the Billings Gazette and received widespread media coverage, the U.S. Department of Defense and the Canadian Department of National Defense announced on February 2nd that NORAD was aware of a high-altitude surveillance balloon believed to belong to China and had been tracking it for several days. The balloon was flying at an altitude of 60,000 feet over Billings. American defense officials considered shooting the balloon down, but initially decided not to due to the risk of debris injuring civilians on the ground. A meeting was convened between Secretary of Defense Austin, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley, Commander General Van Herk, and other military commanders. Officials advised Biden not to shoot it down because debris could threaten civilians or cause property damage. The balloon entered U.S. airspace above the Aleutian Islands on January 28, 2023, moved across Alaska, and entered Canadian airspace over the Yukon and Northwest Territories on January 30, 2023. After flying southeast over British Columbia, the balloon crossed into the U.S. in northern Idaho on January 31st and Montana on February 1st, where it was spotted over Billings. Montana is the location of multiple nuclear missile installations, including Malmstrom Air Force Base, one of 3 U.S. Air Force bases from which intercontinental ballistic missiles are operated, raising suspicions that the balloon had been launched to surveil said nuclear installations. A meteorological researcher calculated a possible trajectory along this path using the HY-AS PLIT atmospheric model, consistent with data on prevailing westerlies from China to Montana. The balloon was spotted above northwest Missouri, near Kansas City, on February 3rd. An unnamed U.S. defense official told the Washington Post that the balloon was not a derelict object, as it generally followed jet stream patterns, but loitered when it was near sensitive sites, such as the Malmstrom Air Force Base. The Post said that observation undermined Chinese assertions that the balloon was a wayward device. The U.S. ground-based intercontinental nuclear arsenal comprises about 400 LGM. 30 Minuteman, 3 missiles deployed in missile silos around Malmstrom AFB, Montana, Minot AFB, North Dakota, and Francis E. Warren AFB, Wyoming. Experts interviewed by Time said that the balloon traveled much longer than what would be expected of a standard weather balloon, and that Chinese officials should not have been surprised that the balloon would have eventually either crossed the U.S. or faced detection. During the incident, a U.S. defense official stated that the balloon had limited additive value from an intelligence collection perspective. Nonetheless, the Pentagon took steps to protect its assets from leaking sensitive information to the balloon. U.S. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said the U.S. military was able to collect valuable intelligence on the balloon while it was transiting North America. Van Hux said that the U.S. Department of Defense obtained special authorization to collect intelligence against the balloon within the U.S. The balloon was monitored by crewed aircraft deployed by NORAD, including a Boeing E-3 Sentry Airborne Early Warning and Control System, also known as AWACS, a Boeing RC-135 reconnaissance aircraft from Nellis Air Force Base, and an F-22 Raptor from Langley Air Force Base. The U.S. Department of Defense said that during the balloon's overflight from the United States, it had blocked the balloon from gathering intelligence and was able to study the balloon and its equipment. A U.S. government official said that at least 2 U-2's reconnaissance aircraft were used to gather data on the balloon while it was over the Midwest. Though it was not clear at which points in the balloon's flight it was tracked by U-2's aircraft. The war zone commented that the U-2's high flight ceiling, exceeding 70,000 feet, allowed it to observe the balloon from within relative proximity, including from above, and its electronic warfare suite allowed the aircraft to jam or monitor radio emissions from the balloon, including data transmissions directed upwards towards Chinese communications satellites. On February 4th, the balloon drifted to the Carolinas. The Federal Aviation Administration closed the airspace over the area in one of the largest temporary flight restrictions in U.S. history, more than 5 times the restricted airspace surrounding Washington, D.C., and nearly double the state of Massachusetts. A ground stop was ordered on the coast at Myrtle Beach International Airport, Charleston International Airport in South Carolina, and Wilmington International Airport in North Carolina. Military aircraft were reported to be over the Carolinas. U.S. officials later stated that this was in preparation for the eventual downing of the balloon within American territorial waters over the Atlantic. Debris from the balloon was dispersed over an area of 2¼ square kilometers, where the ocean was about 47 feet deep, and collection efforts were initiated for further inspection. Van Hux said the United States Navy was conducting recovery operations while the U.S. Coast Guard was securing the region where the debris fell. The guided missile destroyer USS Oscar Austin, guided missile cruiser USS Philippine Sea, and dock landing ship USS Carter Hall was tasked with retrieving the balloon wreckage, alongside Coast Guard cutters and helicopters, U.S. Navy divers, and FBI counterintelligence agents. General Van Hux stated that unmanned underwater vehicles controlled from rigid inflatable boats used side-scan sonar to locate the sunken debris. The crewless vehicles analyzed the wreckage to identify potential threats to recovery divers, such as explosives or batteries with hazardous materials. The sunken payload was estimated to weigh more than 2,000 pounds. On February 6, Some downed payloads were sent to the FBI laboratory in Quantico, Virginia, for forensic analysis by the Bureau's Operational Technology Division. Possible balloon debris was spotted later on the South Carolina coast, where police asked residents to report other sightings. China said it wanted the wreckage returned, but the US said it had no plans to do so. By February 13th, the US have recovered a significant portion of the balloon's payload off the South Carolina coast. The payload measured 30 feet long and had the craft's tech gear and antennas. Northcom said, recovery operations near South Carolina continue. Crews have been able to recover significant debris from the site, including all of the priority sensor and electronics pieces identified, as well as large sections of the structure. Weather permitted crane operations at the site late last week. Due to weather today, underwater recovery activities are limited but will resume as conditions permit. Secretary of State Blinken postponed a scheduled diplomatic trip to China in response, which would have been the first such visit since 2018. The White House did not want to announce the balloon's incursion to protect Blinken's trip, but press and social media interest made Pentagon officials comment. In response to questions regarding the situation, on February 4th, Biden said, "We're going to take care of it." Later that day, US officials disclosed that he had granted permission to down the balloon 3 days earlier. Pentagon officials stated that there was no earlier opportunity to shoot down over the water, rebutting Trump and other Republicans who criticized the Biden administration for not shooting down the balloon earlier. Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer added, "The bottom line here is that shooting down the balloon over the water wasn't just the safest option, but it was the one that maximized our intel gain." On February 6, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman briefed 150 diplomats from about 40 embassies on China's balloon surveillance program, said by U.S. officials to have been run for several years by the People's Liberation Army from Hainan on China's south coast, as part of an effort to name and shame Chinese espionage by publicly calling it out. Officials are separately reaching out to countries where they say there have been at least 24 such overflights since 2018, including Japan, India, Vietnam, Taiwan, and the Philippines, in addition to North and South America. The U.S. House Armed Services Committee held a February 7th hearing on wide-ranging Chinese military and intelligence threats, including the balloon incursions. Committee Chair Republican Mike Rogers characterized the balloon as an intentionally calculated show of force. A U.S. official told the Washington Post there was no sense that the balloon was a deliberate provocation, as it was part of an ongoing global surveillance program. The U.S. House of Representatives voted 419-0 to adopt a resolution condemning China for the incident. Trump called reports of intrusions during his administration fake disinformation. His ex-top national security officials said they were unaware of balloon incursions during their tenure. Biden administration National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said that improved airspace surveillance ordered by Biden after he took office had detected the previous incursions and enhanced our capacity to be able to detect things that the Trump administration was unable to detect. On February 10th, the US added 6 entities accused of being associated with China's balloon surveillance program to the US Commerce Department Bureau of Industry and Securities Entity List, a US exports blacklist. The entities, as listed in the final rule, published on February 14th, are Beijing Nanjing Aerospace Technology Company Limited, China Electronics Technology Group Corporation 40th Research Institute, Dongwon Lincoln Remote Sensing Technology Company Limited, Eagles Men Aviation Science and Technology Group Company Limited, Guangzhou Qian Haishan Aviation Technology Company Limited, Shaanxi Eagles Men Aviation Science and Technology Group Company Limited, Canadian officials and Global Affairs Canada summoned the Chinese ambassador to Canada, Kong Piwu, to Ottawa. At the same time, the Department of National Defense announced it was monitoring the situation alongside the United States through NORAD. A statement from the Canadian Armed Forces said there was no threat to Canadians, and Minister of Foreign Affairs Melanie Joly would remain in contact with Blinken. On February 3rd, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson Mao Ning said, "It is a civilian airship used for research, mainly meteorological purposes. Affected by the westerlies and with limited self-steering capability, the airship deviated far from its planned course." She said China regretted the unintentional incident, citing force majeure. On February 6, Mao said that the US hyped up the incident on purpose and even used force to attack, and called the shootdown an unacceptable and irresponsible action. Following the downing on February 5, Vice Foreign Minister Xi Feng said he had filed a formal complaint with the US Embassy in response to the incident. She accused the United States of indiscriminately using force against the civilian airship that was about to leave US airspace in violation of the spirit of international law and international practice, and said that the Chinese government reserved the right to take further necessary responses. On February 6, a Chinese diplomat said in an interview with the French news network LCI that the United States should return the recovered balloon debris to China. The incident coincided with the release of the science fiction film The Wandering Earth 2 in mainland China, causing some netizens and media to refer to the incident as the wandering balloon jokingly. On February 12, Chinese authorities said they had discovered an unidentified flying object near the Yellow Sea off eastern Shandong and were preparing to shoot it down. On February 13th, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, through its spokesperson Wang Wenbin, claimed that the US high-altitude balloons had illegally crossed China's airspace more than 10 times. China provided no evidence for its claim. The US denied ever operating surveillance balloons over China, calling the claim the latest example of China scrambling to do damage control to distract from China's operation of a high-altitude surveillance balloon program for intelligence collection that it has used to violate the sovereignty of the US and over 40 countries across 5 continents. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said the balloon confirms a pattern of Chinese behavior where we see that China has invested heavily in new capabilities, including different types of surveillance and intelligence platforms, and that it presents security challenges for the members of the alliance. Amidst ongoing Australia-China trade war, Australian Minister for Foreign Affairs Penny Wong said, "I believe the US has managed this as carefully as possible. They brought the balloon down over their own territorial waters." Venezuela's foreign ministry condemned the United States for shooting down what they stated was a crewless civilian aircraft that posed no threat. Prime Minister Rishi Sunak stated on February 13th that the United Kingdom's government would do whatever it takes to defend the country from observation balloons. He added that the Royal Air Force had placed Typhoon jets on standby. Furthermore, ex-MI6 Chief Sir Alex Younger, noting the systematic nature of China's surveillance program, opined that the UK must wake up to China's threat to global security. Michael Clark, a British defense analyst, said that China wanted to be noticed with the balloon. He suggested that the spy balloon flyover was a response to an agreement signed by the United States and the Philippines on February 2, 2023, which allowed the US military access to 4 more military bases in the Philippines as part of a joint pushback against what Clark called China's illegal 9-dash line claims to the South China Sea. John Blacksand, a professor of international security and intelligence studies at the Australian National University, said that the Chinese likely expected the balloon to be detected. He further suggested that the balloon being detected was the goal. Blackstone believes that one of the reasons the balloon was launched was to embarrass the US, with intelligence gathering being a secondary goal. He also said that the balloon could be designed to test the resolve of Washington. On the shooting of the balloon, Christopher Tommy, a security scholar, said that any Chinese response would be restrained and China would want to sweep this under the rug and emphasize senior-level visits within months. The Washington Post columnist Ishan Tharoor contextualized the incident as part of Cold War II. The incident was satirized in the cold open of the show Saturday Night Live the evening after it was shot down. In the sketch, performer Baoan Yang portrayed an anthropomorphized depiction of the downed balloon being interviewed by MSNBC journalist Katie Ta, played by Chloe Feynman. Some sources paid particular attention to Yang's line, "Come brats, you shot a balloon," with USA Today using it in the headline of its coverage. On February 3rd, the US Department of Defense stated that a second Chinese surveillance balloon had been detected, this one flying over Latin America. The Costa Rican General Directorate of Civil Aviation confirmed the incursion by an object not of Costa Rican origin that locals had first seen on February 2nd. The Colombian Air Force said that on the morning of February 3rd, it had detected an object with characteristics similar to those of a balloon at the height of 55,000 feet and traveling at a speed of 25 knots, and after determining it was not a threat to national security and defense or air safety, had continued to track it until it left Colombian airspace. Sightings of the balloon were also reported from Venezuela, specifically from Maracaibo. On February 6, Mao Ning, the spokeswoman for the Chinese government, confirmed the balloon belonged to China, but said that it was used for flight tests and was blown off course in much the same manner as the one spotted over North America. Then, less than a week later, on February 10, 2023, the United States Air Force shot down a high-altitude object that had entered US airspace over Alaska a day before. The thing was shot down onto the Beaufort Sea. The Department of Defense said it was the size of a small car and flying northeast at approximately 40,000 feet, posing a risk to civilian flight. On February 11th, another high-altitude object was shot down in the Yukon Territory. United States National Security Council Coordinator John Kirby said it was much smaller than the spy balloon that we took down last Saturday and was about the size of a small car. The Chinese balloon shot down in the Atlantic was at 60,000 feet, while the Alaska object was at about 40,000 feet, thus presenting a more significant threat to commercial aircraft. The unidentified flying object was described as cylindrical silver and appearing to float. It was detected by US radar at 9 p.m. AKST on February 9th, and US Northern Command sent an E-3 Sentry AWACS aircraft to track it, supported by in-flight refueling. 2 flypasts were conducted, one on the evening of February 9th and the other on the morning of February 10th. 35 fighter jets deployed from Eielson Air Force Base and F-22 fighter jets from Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, also known as JBER, to make a visual inspection, found it was uncrewed. A source briefed on the intelligence told CNN that the pilots gave differing accounts of what they had seen. Some pilots said that the object interfered with their sensors on their aircraft, but other pilots did not report this. Some pilots said that they could not identify any means of propulsion on the object. One US official told CNN that the thing did not appear to have any surveillance equipment. According to US officials, the object had traveled over land in Alaska before heading northward to sea at a speed of 20 to 40 miles per hour. At around 10:45 a.m. AKST on February 10th, the object was shot down by an AIM-9X Sidewinder fired by an F-22 Raptor from JBER. marking the model's second air-to-air kill. President Joe Biden ordered the shootdown out of what Kirby called an abundance of caution. Pentagon Press Secretary Pat Ryder called it a reasonable threat to the safety of civilian flight. The object landed on the frozen sea off Deadhorse, near the Prudhoe Bay oil field, in the United States territorial waters. A Department of Defense official said it broke into pieces. The U.S. Navy, U.S. Coast Guard, and FBI are participating in efforts to recover the object. Search and rescue aircraft such as the CH-47 Chinook, HC-130 and HH-60 Pave Hawk were used in the effort. It remains unclear who owned the object. On February 11th, U.S. Northern Command said they had no new information to share about the capabilities, purpose or origin of the object, and that recovery operations continued but were affected by Arctic weather conditions such as wind chill, snow, and limited daylight hours. A Pentagon spokesman said on the same day that recovery teams were collecting the debris on top of the ice. U.S. divers and unmanned underwater vehicles retrieved additional debris. President Biden said that the shootdown was a success. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said he was briefed on the incursion and supported the decision to take action. In a statement made shortly after the object was downed, Alaska Governor Mike Dunleavy said it raises serious national security concerns that should concern every American, that it is a reminder of Alaska's geopolitical strategic importance, and that the Alaska National Guard is working closely with U.S. Northcom and other agencies to provide any support as requested. The White House stated the leading explanation for the objects was commercial or research entities and therefore totally benign. On February 11th, on previous orders of Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, a small cylindrical object was shot down over the Yukon Territory for violating Canadian airspace. Both US and Canadian aircraft had scrambled, and a US F-22 jet fighter made the kill. On February 12th, the US military shot down a fourth unidentified object over Lake Huron within the Maritime Territory of Michigan. On February 14th, the US government announced that the latter three high-altitude objects shot down over North America were likely private entities with no relations to China. Further analysis and debris collections were underway. Time will tell when or if this frightening trend continues. The ramifications of it have yet to be revealed. In the interim, keep watching the skies.